about the punitive nature of the state now that it wields.
News.com.
This is the Mark Steyn Show. We were talking about the punitive nature of the state now that it wields extraordinary powers granted to it by technology. It knows everything we do, every moment of the day, pretty much anywhere we are on the planet that you'd want to be, unless you're like in upcountry Waziristan or somewhere like that. Let's return to that punitive aspect, because statsman Jamie Jenkins, formerly of the Office of National Statistics, is here with us. And I guess when I was talking to June about the low take-up of the latest booster or whatever it is, both June and I assumed the COVID era is over and life after a fashion is staggering on. But in the dominant power of the Western world, that's to say the United States of America, they're not really post-COVID yet.
No, good evening, Mark. I think, great chat there with June, and she raised some important points there. I think that you can go out there and you will see people who chose to have a vaccination because of the vaccine mandates that were kind of, or vaccine passports, whichever we want to call it, that were in place across the world, where you couldn't go to visit different countries if you hadn't had a vaccine. Now, I tell you what's interesting when you look at the United States, Mark, because you still can't enter the United States if you're a non kind of US citizen. You can't enter unless you've had 2 vaccinations. Now, I think your production team have got a clip now from, I think it's from back in last September, where Joe Biden was talking about the kind of the pandemic. Yeah. And I think he was saying kind of the pandemic is over. So this is last September, I think, Mark.
Yeah.
Mr. President, first Detroit Auto Show in 3 years.
Yeah.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. And so I think it's changing, and I think this is a perfect example of it.
Yeah, the pandemic is over, but as you say, if you're a non-US citizen and you're a German businessman flying into JFK or LAX for 2 days of business meetings, you can't actually land in America unless you can prove that you've been properly vaccinated. What's the science behind that, Jamie?
Well, that's the good question, Mark, because I wrote a blog last July, and I would probably talk to you over the last several months about this one. It was kind of highlighting the fact that Novak Djokovic at the time wasn't allowed into the United States to partake in the US Open, and he was the Wimbledon champion at this time. So obviously, I'd like to see the stats from Joe Biden on how many people he killed in the UK by competing in Wimbledon. I don't think they'll find any people there at all. And remember, he was banned originally from Australia from going in, but as Biden was there talking about last September, in terms of moving on from the pandemic is over, we're in this living with COVID phase. Even the likes of the draconian rules that they had at the borders in Australia were relaxed. And what did Djokovic go and do? He goes and enters Australia and he wins the Australian Open. Now, what's interesting with Joe Biden here, Mark, is that he's asked now, there's some tennis tournaments going on in the US, and we do know he's come out quite openly and said that he's had no vaccine, which is why he hasn't been able to play in some tournaments. But I think there's a Miami Open coming up soon, and there was an exemption put in for into the kind of the US for him to enter, and it's been rejected. Now, what was strange on this, there was a debate in Congress in the US recently, and there was a vote in Congress because the Republicans are trying to get rid of this mandate. They're basically trying to bring America into line with the rest of the world. Now, what happened there is being voted through, but it has to then go through kind of the Senate. It has to go then through kind of Joe Biden as well. And Joe Biden himself, the White House came up and said that they opposed this Congress motion to get rid of the vaccine kind of passport. They were saying that it was the science that led us to bring this in the first place. So the science should let us come out of that. So let's look at the numbers then, Mark. So what we know, I think if we were going back very, very earlier on in the pandemic and with the vaccinations, and what I wrote this time last year, or I'll say in July last year, is that if you had a vaccination, within that first 90 days, the chances of you testing positive for COVID was reduced. But after that 90 days, if you were unvaccinated or you were double jabbed, there was no difference whatsoever. And that was, at the point in time, Mark, where people had been double jabbed within that 3-month period. Now, the last second doses, we're not talking about these booster rollouts that have been going on where some are on their third, fourth, or fifth. Most of the vaccinations for double jab would have been easily around 18 months ago. Yeah. So the difference between somebody's likelihood of having COVID and then passing it on to somebody else, between the unvaccinated and somebody who's double jabbed, totally no difference whatsoever. So what Biden's now got the US into a position on is that, for example, somebody who's got COVID but has had 2 vaccinations, and they might know, oh yeah, I'm not feeling too great, I definitely got COVID, I've done one of those tests. They can jump on a plane, enter the US, coming in, sir, coming in, madam, we don't care, you've had 2 jabs, don't worry about if you got COVID or not. But then somebody who may have done all the tests, tested daily, unvaccinated, oh, sorry, you can't come in. What is the science behind that? There is no science, Mark. Absolute nonsense. And I think we've got to the point now where the USA are not allowing these people in. But if Djokovic wanted to go and play in the China Open, he would have to do a negative lateral flow test, but he would be allowed in. Now, through the last 3 years, we've all been talking about around the world the draconian rules that are in China, but the US are much worse now than even what you've got in China. Nonsense.
Just let's emphasize that, because we're all told, must follow the science, must follow the science. The science here is that, as you said, if there's a guy who's been double jabbed and thus qualifies for US entry, a Frenchman or an Irishman or whatever he is, he qualifies for US entry because he's been double jabbed, but his next door neighbor who is unvaccinated doesn't qualify for US entry, even though the science says the one is no more or less contagious than the other. That's where the science is right now.
No, indeed, that's where the science is right now. Like I said, when we were earlier on in the pandemic, you could start looking at the data and see that the likelihood of you testing positive for COVID was reduced. But, 18 months ago, this is, Mark, what we're looking at. And how many people have had COVID over the last 18 months as well? Lots of unvaccinated people have built up what you would class as that natural immunity. So even if the likelihood of them testing positive now, if you're unvaccinated, is much less reduced than what it was 18 months ago. So, and you got, you talk about the mainstream here. This isn't kind of some random people kind of on the outskirts saying, oh, well, this is a good policy. You've got people like John McEnroe who are criticizing, the president, saying this doesn't make sense. This is absurd. And if you've got, you can't get much more mainstream than the likes of John McEnroe are coming out saying this is absurd. And what's really interesting in terms of the science, Mark, is that Joe Biden has said, and this was a couple of months ago, that we are going to lift this. So, okay, there are plans. The US will start coming into line with the rest of the world, but it won't happen until the 11th of May. So I'd like to know, is COVID suddenly just going to on the 10th of May decide, right, Biden's told us we've got to get out of the country now, we're going to go and vanish on the 11th of May. Yeah. To say months and months in advance that we're going to get rid of everything on the 11th of May when the rest of the world has already done it, goes to show this is clearly nothing to do with the science in the US, Mark. It's completely to do with control.
COVID's tourist visa expires on May the 11th and it will have to depart. It will have to move to Canada or Mexico or the Bahamas or somewhere. We can take that to the bank. One thing that shouldn't be forgotten, you sent me a clip by Jeremy Hunt, currently His Majesty's Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I don't think we should forget that government ministers were saying things like this as if it was perfectly normal. Let's have a look at Mr. Hunt here.
I very much agree with the central point in Gabriel's paper that we should be aiming for zero infection and elimination of the disease, because that is basically the approach taken in countries which have a SARS strategy as opposed to a flu strategy. And those are the countries that have overwhelmingly been the most successful in tackling coronavirus. My sister lives in Beijing, and she flew back to Beijing in the middle of lockdown. And just to give you an idea of the contrast, she was escorted from the airport in Beijing to her home by Ministry of Health officials, and then put into her home for 2 weeks quarantine. The door was sealed, and she had a police car sitting outside her house periodically. And I'm not saying we go that far in this country, but I just think it's an indication of how serious they are in the countries that have had to deal with SARS about stopping at the root every possible source of infection.
Now, that's a madman talking there, isn't it? I mean, that's actually crazier than anything they did in the Great Plague of London 3.5 centuries ago. The idea of eliminating it by sealing your door so you can't leave the house and putting a police car outside the door. And yet Jeremy Hunt's thesis is that shows you're taking it seriously.
No, absolute nonsense in terms of, you're right here, Mark. So what that clip is, he was attending, I think, an independent SAGE briefing. So this isn't the official SAGE who were advising government at the time. It was a kind of a group of kind of academics and, you know, mathematicians, operational researchers who decided to come together and look through what was going on in the pandemic. And they were making various calls across, you know, the mainstream media. A lot of these people on this group, you know, who were supportive of some of these views of what Jeremy Hunt was saying, they were regularly on BBC, Sky News, scaring the public, you know, anything that could be put out there to scare, you know, oh, we need to have further more lockdowns. You know, the modelling was bad enough from SAGE, and some of the stuff that was coming out from this group was really alarmist. But for Jeremy, and it's the context here, Mark, is that at the time, he wasn't in government, but he was the chair of the Health Select Committee. So he was being interrogative of the government. So you would get him kind of as the chair of the Health Select Committee in Parliament. He would be interrogating the government of the day at the time, calling on why aren't you doing X, why aren't you doing Y, no, you know, scrutinizing the government's decisions as part of the chair of that. But yeah, to say that, you know, the fact that he's raised the point that the door was sealed and the police car was pre-rolling outside, as if it's kind of, he did say, you know, give him his due, he did say, I'm not saying we should go that far, but is he kind of suggesting that we weren't going, you know, towards that? And now he's been coming out, I think, over the weekend saying there is still, you know, there's lots that can be learned from the Sweden approach. You know, he will say that where things are mandated in countries like the United Kingdom and other countries, that Sweden took a more voluntary approach. We'd have to go through all of the details to see exactly what happened there. But we can't forget, Mark, you know, when you're looking back in the history, that people like Jeremy Hunt, if he was in government at the time, and he's in government now, if this all happened again, would he be calling for similar things? And we know, and we've got the records now, Mark. What happened in China?
Yeah.
They sealed the doors. Yeah. They had the police cars outside, and COVID still ripped through society to the point that they were protesting, and they just had to give up in the end. And absolute pain, you know, all that pain for no gain.
And he wasn't saying, you know, let's do what they're doing in Stockholm. He was saying, let's do what they're doing in Peking. And actually setting aside, you know, as some of those WhatsApp as Boris Johnson himself says in one of those WhatsApp messages, oh yeah, I can see this might be a bit of a problem if you're over 80 or you have an underlying condition, but otherwise I don't see what the big deal is. Well, that's the view they took in Sweden, so they didn't cripple the 99.9% of normal life in order to deal with this one little thing. So when all the time everybody was locked down, if you went on the internet and you looked at scenes from Malmo and Gothenburg and Östersund, there's normal life, people sitting in bars, sidewalk cafes, having a beer, having a grand old time, and all the things you couldn't do in lockdown land.
No, and I live in Wales, Mark, and you know, we had further things than what you had kind of in England. There was a point in time where if you went into a supermarket, you could pick up some groceries, but if you fancy picking up some clothes in one of the aisles, they were all kind of blocked off, saying, well, you can't buy clothes here. It's a non-essential item. Now, at the time, people were saying, well, that's to try and stop fewer, you know, get fewer people visiting some of these stores, and it's not fair on the clothes shop that's been locked down. Well, maybe we shouldn't have closed the clothes shop in the first place. And you know, online stores like Amazon absolutely boomed through kind of lockdown. And you're right that we've got to look over the last years, and these lockdown files that have been coming out in the United Kingdom through Matt Hancock's kind of WhatsApp messages are quite revealing, and they kind of, ironically, what you talked about there with Boris, but other things that a lot of people were saying at the time, but they were being sidelined across the media. So if somebody come on, say, one of your shows through the pandemic and said, oh, we shouldn't be putting masks on children, you know, we shouldn't be doing that. You know, some people are getting cancelled for saying things like that. And then there's WhatsApp messages now from the chief medical advisor, Chris Whitty, at the time, where the context here, Mark, just for people who are watching, is that there's a WhatsApp exchange going on where people are saying, oh, well, Nicola Sturgeon is masking children in classes up in Scotland. should we go and do that in England?
Right.
And somebody saying, well, what does the science say? What do the scientists say? And Chris Whitty has pretty much come out and said, there's no real evidence for it. There's no real evidence against it. It wouldn't be good, in the classroom.
Yeah,
and ironically,
let's just put up that WhatsApp message, because I think we have it here highlighted. Yeah, unless Chris, Patrick, etc., are willing to go out and say that the WHO and the Scots are wrong, I think some nervous parents will freak out about the mask mandate happening in Scotland but not in England. In other words, they've created an environment in which just in the UK, you've got 4 separate jurisdictions. So they're all kind of outbidding each other, So if someone in Edinburgh does something, someone in Belfast says, oh, we have to match that, or else we won't look as if we're taking it serious. But there's no science behind any of this. This is just the climate of fear that the state created.
No, indeed. And I remember when there was a lot of discussion because masks were in, and I think then were coming off a bit. Were we going to put masks back in? And Nadeem Zahawi was being interrogated across the media because I think he was the Secretary of State for Education at the time, when he was actually in government. But there was a talk about, should we be putting, and he said, oh, well, we're going to release some data and they'll support it. We've got some data that's coming out. And this data came out, if on the government's own website. This isn't some, study that's in some third journal somewhere. This is the government's own website. And it's a study looking at masks in class where they've got masks in some schools and not masks in some other schools. And basically what the findings of this study that came out, which will alarm people, it won't shock people, I suppose, given what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, Mark, is that what it said is there's no statistical difference. And what they do is they can look at the rates, and obviously there's going to be a margin of error when you're doing any stats, when you're kind of doing a little sample survey. But they said they can't find any statistical difference in the absence rates for those schools where masks were in the classrooms and masks where they weren't. But what they also cite in the same report, that the direct health risk of COVID to children remains very low. But more alarming, and they went ahead and did this, Mark, this is what's most alarming, is that 94% of teachers, you think, well, they're the experts in terms of what children are in school to do, which is to learn. They said they thought it made communication with children, 94% of teachers, it made communication with children more difficult. And that's the problem here. There was no evidence to bring it in school. We had masks across the whole of society because Nicola Sturgeon is bringing them in. And as I say, if people were talking about, don't wear masks, you look at some tweets from prominent journalists, BBC kind of football presenters as well, kind of talking about anti-maskers. Those were the things that were coming out. You were being cancelled for pretty much saying what Chris Whitty now is being revealed in these messages is saying himself.
Terrible. The groupthink media in the UK has a lot to answer for on this, and we do need a general accounting. We need something like the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or whatever they called it after the apartheid era, because these you can't just pull a Jeremy Hunt and say, oh, sorry, I misspoke when I said China, I meant to say Sweden. You can't just do that 2 years later and expect to get away with it. Terrific stuff as always from our statsman. You can find Jamie at statsjamie.co.uk, or you can check him out on Twitter at statsjamie.